Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about William Shakespeare's Henry VI Part 3, which, as you might guess from the title, follows after Parts 1 and 2, even though this was, like Part 2, probably written before Part 1. So these weren't originally a trilogy, but then when they were collected up for the first folio, published in 1623, they were organized chronologically rather than in the order that Shakespeare wrote them. Also, Henry VI Part 3 is not the original title of this play. As with Part 2, there's a different title that it was originally published under in quarto form, which may or may not have been the title that it would have been originally performed under, may or may not have been the title that Shakespeare himself would have given it initially. So in the folio, when this was listed as the third play, it was called The Third Part of Henry VI with the Death of the Duke of York. When it was originally published in quarto form, it was called The True Tragedy of Richard, Duke of York, and the Death of Good King Henry VI, with the whole contention between the two houses of Lancaster and York. Which again is an extraordinarily pithy title that just rolls right off the tongue. But basically what we get in Henry VI Part 3 is the English Civil War. Not the English Civil War, but an English Civil War. The War of the Roses, which pits the House of Lancaster, led for most of this play by Henry VI, or at least nominally led by Henry VI. We'll talk more about that. Versus the House of York, led for Act 1 by Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and then after he dies at the beginning of Act 1, led by his son Edward, who becomes Edward IV, and also Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who is Richard Plantagenet's son, Edward's brother. There are a lot of names and shifting alliances to keep straight in this place. That's one thing to be aware of before you start reading this. There's so many people named Richard and Edward and Henry. So when I'm talking about Richard, the original Duke of York, in the first act, the one who's the main antagonist of Part 2 of Henry VI, I'm going to call him Richard Plantagenet. When I'm talking about the guy who will later become Richard III, I'm going to call him Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Even though he's only Duke of Gloucester for part of this play. So that's going to make it a little bit easier. When I'm talking about Richard of York, Richard Duke of York, and also King Edward, when I'm talking about Edward Duke of York, who partway through the play becomes Edward IV, I'm just going to call him Edward, or Edward Duke of York. When I'm talking about Henry VI's son, Edward, I actually don't know, I'm going to talk about him very much, but I'd call him Prince Edward. So hopefully that helps. But basically the thing that we get in this play is just a sort of back and forth of the Wars of the Roses, in which these two factions struggle for control of the crown. And at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 5, Henry, who's not a strong king, and he's not really involved in the military side of things, he's just sort of in a garden or something, sort of thinking about the problems facing the kingdom, and he expresses this sort of back and forth struggle really eloquently. He says, "This battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. What time the shepherd's blowing off his nails can neither call it perfect day nor night. Now sways it this way like a mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometime the flood prevails, and then the wind, now one the better, then the other best. both tugging to be victors breast to breast, yet neither conquered nor neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war. Here to this molehill will I sit me down. To whom God will, there will be the victory. So he compares the tides of battle to actual tides, to ocean tides. Sometimes things favor Lancaster, sometimes things favor York, and then they shift, and they shift, and they shift. And this is a really apt description of what happens in the play, because basically it is a series of reversals. We start almost immediately with Henry on the back foot. So in Act 1, Scene 1, we pick up where we had left off at the end of Henry VI, Part 2, which was the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Edward is initially successful against Henry. The Yorkists have taken the advantage. And so in Act 1, Scene 1, we have a couple of really interesting things that happen. I want to point out this one, where Warwick, Exeter, King Henry, and Richard Plantagenet are talking. There's a bunch of other people talking as well. They're in sort of Parliament, and they're having a debate about who is the rightful king. And one of the arguments that King Henry makes is that his father was the king, his grandfather was the king, and there's a question of he only became king because York's grandfather abdicated by force. So basically, Richard Bolingbroke, who was Henry's ancestor, I think, if I'm getting this right. It's complicated. And medieval dynastic politics is not my specialty. Richard Bolingbroke forced, or Henry Bolingbroke? Yeah, sorry. Henry Bolingbroke forced Richard II to resign, to abdicate the kingdom, and that was how King Henry's lineage was established. There's debate about whether or not this is legitimate. And so Warwick, who's a Yorkist, and York himself, Richard Plantagenet, actually managed to sow the seeds of doubt in Exeter. And so right from the beginning, we get this sense that nothing here is stable. Everything is open to change. And that's actually really interesting because that happens throughout the play. Like, there are continually people who switch sides, either because they're convinced that the other person's claim is right, or because something has happened that has upset them with their own faction, and so they go to the other side. The most distinctive of which is when Warwick, who throughout Part 2 and the first half of Part 3 is one of the biggest supporters of the Yorkist claim, he switches sides. And it's a major blow. Basically what happens is Edward becomes Edward IV, and he sends Warwick to France to make a deal, a political marriage basically, between Edward and Lady Bona, who is Louis of France's sister. So this is going to be a political marriage that's going to secure the two kingdoms. It's going to unite them as one. The problem is, and Queen Margaret, who is the sort of actual leader of the Lancastrian faction, since Henry VI is basically just like, whatever. I'm not really that good at being king, so I'm just going to let other people fight the war for me. So Queen Margaret is one of those people who takes the lead. She has now gone to France to try and get help from Louis to re-invade England and re-establish Henry as king. Warwick has gone... So Margaret's there. She's trying to get Louis on her side. Warwick is there. He's offering this marriage that will get Louis on Edward's side. The problem is, just as Warwick's about to seal this deal, a messenger shows up who brings some letters that's basically like, yeah, Edward went and married Lady Grey, who is a sexy widow that he got real into. So, Louis and his sister are understandably pissed because they were about to agree to this marriage, and now they find out that Edward was just like, meh, fuck that chick. Margaret is overjoyed because now Louis and his sister are pissed at Edward, so they're going to give her soldiers. And Warwick is like, listen, man, this dude humiliated me. Like, he sent me over here to arrange this marriage, then he goes and marries somebody else. Like, now I look like an idiot here in front of the King of France, so I'm going to switch sides, and I'm going to... Louis, give me like 5,000 troops, 5,000 French troops, and I'm going to go invade England on behalf of Henry VI. So that's the kind of play that this is. It's just this back and forth of like, now one side is in control and now the other, etc., etc. So that's the plot, basically. The whole plot is a seesaw of power dynamics switching. But there's some other interesting stuff here that I think is really worth considering. One of which is Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And I had talked about this in my video about Henry VI Part 2 as well, because in Richard Plantagenet, in that play, we get these sort of previews of the character who becomes Richard III in a later play. In Part 3, we have Richard of Gloucester, who again becomes Richard III, and we're already getting that sense. Like, there's a lot of speeches in the latter half of this play that Richard makes that are very similar to things we get in Richard III. I also think he's a really fascinating character here, because actually, for as much as Edward becomes king, Edward IV, I feel like a lot of the time Richard is really driving the action. Richard is always sort of there. He's often setting himself up sort of in a supporting role, but I actually feel like he's the one pushing everything forward. But we also get this villainy and this like hatred of the world that's so characteristic of Richard III. So this is Act 3, Scene 2. At the end, he has an extremely long speech. And basically, this is where Edward has decided to marry Lady Grey. Richard basically puts it down to he just wants to have sex with her, which we don't really have enough evidence to assess whether that's true or not. But he said, I'm just going to read you bits of this speech because it's literally like 75 lines long almost. He says, I, Edward, will use women honorably. Would he were wasted marrow, bones and all, that from his loins no hopeful branch may spring to cross me from the golden time I look for. And yet between my soul's desire and me the lustful Edward's title buried is Clarence, Henry, and his young son Edward, and all the unlooked for issue of their bodies, to make their rooms ere I can place myself. A cold premeditation for my purpose, why then I do but dream on sovereignty, like one who stands upon a promontory and spies a far-off shore that he would tread, wishing his foot were equal with his eye, and chides that sea that sea that sunders him from thence. So we're getting that ambition and that sort of calculating recognition of who is in line for the throne ahead of him. And then a little bit later in the speech, he says, "Well, say there is no kingdom then for Richard. What other pleasure can the world afford? I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap and deck my body in gay ornaments, and switch sweet ladies with my words and looks, sweet ladies with my words and looks. Oh, miserable thought! And more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and for I should not deal in her soft laws, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back, where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every way, like to a chaos or an unlicked bare whelp, that carries no impression like the dam. Oh, am I a man to be beloved? Oh, monstrous fault to harbor such a thought." So again, this is an idea that we get expressed in Richard III, is this idea that Richard of Gloucester is so physically disfigured and so repulsive that no one would ever be able to love him. Incidentally, when they actually found the remains of Richard III under a car park, they did assess his physical condition, and they tried to reconstruct what he would have looked like. And actually, he had scoliosis, I think, and so he had a sort of slightly stooped posture. But there's no evidence that he was as deformed as Shakespeare makes him. So that's worth noting. And one of the arguments actually about Richard III is that it is Tudor propaganda to discredit the Yorkists, specifically Richard III, by painting him as this terribly deformed monster, when in reality he wasn't. But this also comes up at the end of the play, in Act 5, Scene 6, almost the last scene, because we do have Act 5, Scene 7, which is very short. But Richard has come to the Tower of London, where Henry VI is being held, basically to murder him. So, just doing Richard stuff, basically. But Henry, in his in accusing Richard of these sort of crimes that we, because this is a history play, know that Richard will later commit, Henry sort of prophesies these, and he ties it to Richard's physical appearance. And then Richard stabs him, but in his own speech at the end of 5-6, he sort of echoes this idea of because I'm physically deformed, because I'm hideous, whatever it is, I have to be a violent villain. So it's interesting not echoes because this was written before Richard III, but it's interesting sort of previews of what we're going to get in Richard III. The other thing that I find really fascinating is this portion of Act 2, Scene 5, just after Henry has made his speech earlier, where one of the things he talks about is the tide of battle turning and turning. We have two soldiers who come in. The first one says, and each soldier is dragging the body of an enemy soldier. So the first one says, "Ill blows the wind that profits nobody. This man whom hand to hand I slew in fight may be possessed of some store of crowns, and I that haply take them from him now may yet ere night yield both my life and them to some man else, as this dead man doth me." And he takes off the dead man's helmet. "Who's this? O God, it is my father's face, whom in this conflict I unawares have killed. O heavy times begetting such events! From London by the king was I pressed forth. My father, being the Earl of Warwick's man, came on the part of York, pressed by his master. And I, who at his hands received my life, have by my hands of life bereaved him. Pardon me, God, I know not what I did, and pardon, Father, for I knew not thee. My tears shall wipe away these bloody marks, and no more words till they have flowed their fill. So basically, the first soldier has killed his father in battle because they were each conscripted into different sides in the war. The second soldier, it turns out, has killed his son, again, because they were each conscripted into different sides of the war. And so it's a brief scene, and it doesn't play that much of a role in the plot of the play, but what it does is really an interesting acknowledgement of the fact that these dynastic wars, and the plays that Shakespeare writes are peopled largely by nobility and royalty, but in these dynastic wars, it was detrimental to the people of England. Like, masses of people died, they had their livelihoods destroyed, they were crippled, etc., etc. So these were devastating civil wars, and it's a great brief moment where Shakespeare acknowledges that.